Thank you all once again for taking the time this morning to join us. This morning's talk is titled Cyberspace Escalation, Ladders and Lattices. And, one of the big challenges as we think about, multi-domain deterrence, cross-domain deterrence, integrated deterrence, whatever you want to call it this week or this year, is this problem of cognitive mindsets, right? And specific lexicons that people proficient in one domain attempt to apply in another domain. When this is done right, it can be very useful, right? And we've had many an interesting discussion at CGSR in a workshop or within a war game, or as we're drafting a paper about the similarities and differences between concepts and terms within the various domains. Sometimes there can be a lot of useful parallels. However, other times very sloppy analogies or the simple transfer of terms and concepts from one domain to another can be actually harmful, right? Either in terms of thinking about signaling intentions or developing concepts or determining what capabilities we need in our quiver. So we're very fortunate today to have Dr. Olesya Tkacheva and Dr. Martin Libicki with us today to talk about, this space, right? This talk of escalation in cyberspace, which you see a lot of articles about, a lot of loose talk about in the public space, some of which is useful, some of which is not. But I think this is going to be a much deeper and much richer exploration of the similarities and challenges as we think about cyberspace in sort of traditional deterrence terms when we apply terms like escalation and escalation ladders. I'm going to give you a little bit about the authors, just so you have some context for their work and where they're coming from. Dr. Olesya Tkacheva is an assistant professor of data science at Brussels School of Governance, VUB. Her research focuses on the nexus between technology and security with a focus on Russia and Eastern Europe. Prior to coming to Brussels, she worked at the RAND Corporation and in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, where she did a lot of work developing and implementing U.S. responses to counter Russian aggression in Ukraine and Syria. Dr. Martin Libicki holds the Kaiser Chair of Cybersecurity Studies at the U.S. Naval Academy. In addition to teaching, he carries out a great amount of research on cyber war and the general impact of information technology on domestic and national security. He's the author of a 2021 textbook on cyber war called Cyberspace in Peace and War, as well as Conquest in Cyberspace, National Security, and Information Warfare, and a whole bunch of various RAND monographs on the subject. The ground rules of the discussion, for those of you who haven't turned into CGSR events before, we're going to do about 45 minutes of presentation with slides up on the screen for the group. We'll then transition into 45 minutes of a moderated question and answer session. The way this works is that people, as the presenters are presenting, you should feel free to submit questions in the chat as they go along, or raise your hands electronically, and then we can just jump right into the discussion when the presentation concludes. So thank you all again for tuning in. Thank you to the presenters, and Martin, Olesya, over to you, and thank you again for taking the time this morning.
Okay, I think the unmute button on my computer works. That's always a good start. So let's start with the first slide. Okay, what I want to do is to not only address the topic, but embed it in a broader series of concerns having to do with escalation. And there are two broad series of concerns. The first one is the underlying problem of escalation in the current environment, which is to say, as you move to an era of peer and near peer, state-on-state competition with Russia and China, all of whom, by the way, contend in cyberspace and other gray zones, what are the tools, the techniques, the mindsets, etc., that countries can use to prevent a confrontation in one domain from escalating out of control, with the ultimate out of control being a strategic nuclear conflict? Okay, so the fundamental problem is to look at the options that both sides have, or at least that one side has, to keep escalation within bounds. Okay, now we define escalation the way a former RAND colleague of mine, Forrest Morgan, did, which is an increase in the intensity or scope of conflict that crosses thresholds considered significant by one or two participants. And without belaboring the definition, I just want to mention that intensity and thresholds are in many ways two very different concepts. Okay, something can be more intense without crossing a threshold. Something can cross a threshold without, as we're going to discuss, necessarily looking more intense to both sides. But I want to throw in a paradox just quickly. One of the ways that you manage escalation is to try to talk to the other side to get some sort of common understanding of various thresholds, of what various actions portend, of what the red lines are and what the red lines aren't. But anytime you evidence an interest in controlling escalation, you tend to vitiate whatever deterrence you might have in your back pocket that says, don't start anything with me because goodness knows where it's going to end up, okay? But if it turns out that something starts, you don't want it to end up there any more than anyone else does, okay? And that's a well understood problem in international relations. It was remarked on by Henry Kissinger, remarked on by a scholar named Quester. So it's nothing new. Okay, now let's go to the next. Let's go to the next slide here. Okay, and this one is a familiar slide in the sense that it just is there so that we have a common understanding of some of the reasons that countries escalate and some of the reasons that countries do not escalate. Okay? In other words, there are trade-offs involved. Again, this isn't going to be startlingly new. The middle bullet, however, I want to emphasize. Okay? The motives to initiate an escalation tend to be different than the motives to match an escalation. That is to say, initiating escalation is for various reasons more difficult and less likely than matching an escalation. Okay, now that may seem fairly obvious, but when I go into the second broad context, it becomes, the relevance becomes clear. Okay, let me introduce the second context. We're going to spend a lot of time on it. And that is, escalation is a metaphor, right? And as a metaphor, it makes a lot of assumptions about both sides' perception of the conflict. Once you step away from these assumptions, the nature of escalation starts to change, and the assumptions that you draw about escalations themselves change. Okay? Okay, let's go to the next slide quickly. One might find it a bit absurd that you could start with cyber war and end up with thermonuclear war. But I have this quote from somebody of a certain amount of influence in Washington, D.C., which suggests, in fact, that they are worried about incidents in cyberspace culminating in a real shooting war with a major power. So I didn't invent this, right? It is a theme in Washington. Okay, take a 2-second break and let's go to the next slide. Here's the classic book on escalation, okay? This copy from which this picture was shot is quite old, let me put it that way. But the point I want to make here is look at the word after escalation, metaphors, okay? Escalation, in and of itself, a concept. After all, there's a notion of a ladder and an escalator, has a strong set of assumptions behind it. And let's go to the next slide and take a look at these assumptions. So here they are. On the bottom hand is kumbaya, everybody's hugging and kissing, and on the top is Armageddon. And escalation is a phenomena by which both blue and red successively transition from kumbaya to Armageddon. Okay, keep this in mind because we're going to now take a look at some of the assumptions that are wrapped into this metaphor on the next slide. Okay, first, that the rungs are equidistant. Okay, now, to be fair, Herman Kahn was very explicit in saying that just because a nuclear escalation has, I think it was 44 rungs, doesn't mean that that escalation proceeds one rung at a time. In fact, he says more typically several rungs will be marched at a time. But when it turns out that the rungs are not equidistant from one another, it introduces the topic of thresholds. And thresholds are a very important element in escalation management. Okay, second assumption, there is one ladder. Both sides recognize where the rungs are in the ladder. Both sides can measure the rungs on the ladder in much the same way. Okay? Now, the next point is that each rung on one side can be mapped to a rung on the other. In other words, maybe there's not an exact equivalent as to what the various steps on the rungs are, but there is a rough equivalence. You can do a one-to-one mapping, which again can be questioned. The fourth one is that each side can detect the other side's climb up the ladder. Okay, fairly obvious if we're talking nuclear escalation or even conventional escalation. As you get into cyber war and other forms of conflict, much less obvious. And then finally, which is where we're going to focus, that the path upward is linear and singular. Linear means that any two states can be compared. One is more intense than the other. And singular means that there's only a unique set of steps to go from one to the other. Okay? And there's a corollary that every step you climb makes culminating at higher levels all the more likely. Okay, so let's examine each of these implications one at a time. Okay, here we see both sides climbing the escalation ladder, but clearly some of these rungs are farther apart than others, with the implication in the metaphor that it is harder to go up certain rungs than to go up other rungs. And therefore, if you're going to try to manage escalation, you are better off focusing on the rungs that are relatively hard to cross and not focusing on the rungs that are relatively easy to climb. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Okay, the two most salient thresholds are the distinction between war and peace and the distinction between conventional warfare and nuclear warfare, aka the nuclear taboo. One of the phenomena that I believe that cyberspace introduces to the escalation ladder is that it tends to bring the rungs closer together. It makes it easier to slide from one to the other. Now, what do I mean by cyberspace? Basically, I'm using it as a shorthand for information technology / information technology networks, but I'm also using cyberspace not only as a tool of conflict, but as an arena of conflict. Okay, not surprised, many tools, in fact, turn out to become arenas if they become, or as they become, the centers of gravity for opposing forces. Okay, so here's some examples. Cyberspace and conflict in cyberspace is acquiring many of the gray zone characteristics. And by gray zone characteristics, I am talking about not only a transition between peace and war, but the potential misperception about where cyberspace operations fits between peace and war, with some countries understanding it as peace and other countries understanding it as war. If the aggressor believes that a cyberspace operation is like peace, and the target believes that a cyberspace operation is like war, then it's fairly easy to concoct a scenario under which cyberspace operations start at peacetime and end at wartime by providing an intermediary step that is misperceived. If you take a look at cyberspace's information technology, there are many scholars that argue that the ability to carry out significant conventional attacks on nuclear assets, in fact, lead to a situation under which the attacker, believing that it is not using nuclear weapons, thinks it has observed a nuclear taboo, and the target, seeing its nuclear capabilities erode under the impact of conventional weapons, believes that the nuclear taboo has been crossed, thereby sliding from conventional war to nuclear war. Such scholars include Lieber and Press, they include Green and Austin, even Paul Bracken. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So that raises the question, can you establish substitute thresholds? Okay, here, I think a bit of pessimism is in order. Okay, you look at the next bullet. You see a threshold between not lethal and non-lethal, a threshold between operations that hit the homeland and don't hit the homeland, another subsidiary threshold between what might be considered a local conflict and a regional or global conflict, a threshold between tactical and strategic nuclear use. Okay? At the risk of summarizing a very long argument in a very short amount of time, it is difficult to be confident that any of these intermediate thresholds will actually keep parties from staying below it for two basic reasons. One is that they are asymmetric between the United States and either of its superpower competitors. Notably, for instance, the United States has a much easier time keeping war out of its homeland than Russia or China do keeping war out of its homeland, thanks to geography and a few other factors. And the other reason is that they may not be understood the same way. Okay, they are hard to measure. And so the question about whether a threshold has been crossed may be a subject of disagreement between the two. Okay. The search for thresholds, in other words, thresholds that not only mark a distinct state in war, but thresholds that can plausibly keep people from crossing it, assumes that there are stairs of unequal space between them. Because if they were equally spaced, you wouldn't know one threshold from another, or everything would be threshold, okay? So one of the tools of escalation management is to know how to manipulate vis-a-vis these thresholds. Okay, and the assumption is that there are, in fact, thresholds. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, do both sides see the same rungs? Okay, would a homeland threshold to the United States look like a homeland threshold to Russia and China? Okay, both in terms of attacks that cross the threshold by one side and attacks that cross the threshold by the other side. Again, this is a fairly complicated notion, but the consequences of having different thresholds are not particularly complicated, although they may be, well, I'll leave it to you to figure out if they're in fact complicated. Okay, let's go to the next one, the next slide. Okay, this is a hard slide, and I don't really want to spend a whole lot of time in it, so I'm going to leave it basically to the reader. You have them and us, right? They have different thresholds. They differentiate attacks on military support from attacks on civilian infrastructure, from attacks that imperil safety. Okay? We have thresholds, but they're not the same. We differentiate attacks in the field from attacks on the homeland, from attacks on industrial safety, from attacks on personal safety, right? So what happens? If you start at the bottom and we carry out an attack, which we think stays under the threshold of attacks in the field, they go back and make a corresponding attack. But to them, they've never crossed the threshold because both our initial attack and the corresponding attack are both within the threshold of attacks on military support. Okay? But we don't see it that way. We think the other side has attacked our homeland. So we hack a civilian port in their country. They see that as crossing their threshold, and so on and so forth. In other words, you have a situation in which neither side believes that it has escalated. Each side believes it has responded to the other. But the combination of these two give you a high degree of escalation. The next slide basically is another way of looking at it. Here's an escalation spiral, right? On the left, where you have commonly understood thresholds, you have to deliberately cross a blue circle in order to intensify your conflict, in this case from the outside to the inside. But if you have different definitions of threshold, then you see the escalation spiral. Okay? In other words, at no time, sorry, I'm actually pointing to my computer, at no time does anybody actually cross a barrier. But then look where you've gotten to, starting with Taiwan invaded and ending up with nuclear weapons being used on China's homeland, or conversely, America's homeland. The point is that differences in threshold can lead to escalatory behavior that wouldn't otherwise exist. Okay, let's go to the next difference. Okay, the WMD elision I just want to point out. Okay, if you believe that nuclear weapons are separate and distinct from other weapons of mass destruction, then both sides can agree not to be the first one to use nuclear weapons. Okay, and whether or not that holds, at least you will not cross that threshold unconsciously. Okay, but if you start having different definitions of what constitutes weapons of mass destruction, then it's easy to see how what looks like a chemical attack on one hand ends up in a nuclear attack on the other. And if you look at the quote on the bottom, it gets even worse. So here's something from War on the Rocks, in which people call swarms of autonomous drones weapons of mass destruction. Okay? Then all of a sudden your nuclear taboo gets all fuzzed out. And you have a greater potential of going from swarms of armed drones to nuclear use, which is not a position you want to be in. Okay, let's go to the next one. Okay, missing rungs. There are going to be cases where one side escalates and the other side cannot respond. As the next chart suggests, there are many reasons for that difference. Oops, that's just expanding it. Can somebody move a slide, please? Okay, so the other side may lack a capability or a desire. So here's an example, right? If somebody used chemical weapons on the United States, we would not respond with chemical weapons because we don't believe in that. Okay, we believe that it's outside the bounds of warfare. On cyber war, you have a different problem. If the United States got into a cyber war contest with North Korea, it would be asymmetric from the get-go because North Korea does not have an interesting set of targets, and we do. We cannot promise credibly that they shouldn't take out the New York Stock Exchange because we'll take out the Pyongyang Stock Exchange. They neglected to set one up, okay? And then there are other examples. In other words, you can't match it. One side cannot match it, and that's good and bad. On the one hand, you can believe that if you can't match it, you won't escalate. On the other hand, it sets it up for, okay, I cannot match on this level, I'll have to go up to a much higher level. Again, potentially escalatory, because they have missing rungs. It is not always for the advantage of one side, for the other side to have a missing rung, precisely for that risk. Okay, to the next slide. Undetectable escalation. Okay, in other words, you think that the other side is in the same place you are, but in fact they've climbed, right? The thin figure is reality, the thick figure is perception. So the next slide. Okay. Generally speaking, this is sort of novel compared to our conventional understanding of warfare, right? So you have things such as proxy activities, unattributable attacks, increases in surveillance, malware implantation, this is a cyber war angle, mining, especially naval mining, munitions with delayed effects, notably on people, okay? Now, on the one hand, if I can escalate and you don't detect it, right, then you're less likely to escalate until such time as you do detect it. But there's a converse here, and the converse is, if I don't have confidence that you are fighting at the same level as I am, you may be tempted to assume, in fact, that I am doing things that you are unaware of, and therefore it's incumbent upon you on one side to match the other side's escalation. Okay, so it works both ways. Now, both sides may conclude that escalation limits should apply only to acts that can be verified, and that may be a help, but maybe not. Okay, so we finally, with that as a background, go into the event. Okay, and that is our notion that what looks like a ladder may in fact be a lattice, which is to say, it may yield to sideways movement, not just up and down movement. Okay, and sideways movement has essentially two components to it. One is that two particular states cannot be compared with one another, and the other correspondingly is that there may be multiple escalation paths to get to the same outcome. If there are multiple escalation paths, then almost by definition, rungs on each of these paths, waypoints on each of these paths, cannot be compared very easily. Okay, so in other words, it's two sides of the same problem. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so let's ask the question. Is this escalation, right? So, case one. Russia tries to build an A2 bubble. It triggers a buildup of Russia's and then NATO's forces in the Baltic region. Okay, there's a naval standoff between the two. At some point, the two sides back off from another. In other words, there's a reduction in apparent intensification, but at that time, the Russians start carrying out cyber attacks on the U.S. electric grid, okay, on the homeland electric grid. So here's the question. Was that de-escalation because both sides pulled away? Or was it escalation because we've gone from tactical level of warfare to a strategic level of warfare? Okay? Example number two. Again, forces skirmish in the Baltic. Mutual withdrawal, right? Same as the last time. And then Russia experiences cyber attacks on its C4ISR. In other words, on the command and control of its military forces. Here's what makes this tricky. If the C4ISR were solely the C4ISR of the local fleet, okay, then this would be considered a non-lethal version of what could have been a lethal conflict. But C4ISRs between local, regional, global, and oftentimes strategic conflicts are not that cleanly separated. If Russia perceives a NATO cyber attack on C4ISR as having implicated broader military capabilities, and worse, as per James Acton, nuclear capabilities, to Russia, it may seem like preemptive escalation on the part of NATO. Okay, so let's go on to the next one. Okay, why the ambiguity? Okay, one is that different domains sometimes can have different rules. One could, for instance, look at the naval conflicts between England and Netherlands in the 1600s, which were conducted at a certain level of ferocity on the seas, but did not result either in the Netherlands or England in invading one another. The fact that there was water between the two probably helped, but this is an example of conflict in one domain not necessarily spilling to another domain, okay? Another item is that conflict in the tactical realm and in the strategic realm may be viewed differently. It may seem that a strategic conflict is per se escalatory vis-a-vis a tactical conflict, but there are many methods of strategic conflict, such as sanctions, blockades, that in fact do not necessarily entail the use of force, which means that they would sit on a lower level of escalation. When it comes to cyber, there may be different definitions of intensity. Cyber war has yet to produce its first deliberate casualty. On the other hand, the cost of many cyber attacks, particularly NotPetya, are quite high. Cyber attacks have a degree of persistence. They can be maintained for a long period of time, much less expensively than kinetic attacks can be. And oftentimes, and I alluded to this in the last slide, cross-cutting off what is being threatened can be very different depending on how the other side arrays its own information architecture. Okay? Rungs can be both. Let me just go. Okay, let me just skip that and go on to this because I'm running pretty close. Okay, now let's go back one, please. No, the next one. Thank you. Okay, path dependence is an important component in the understanding of escalation. There are 5 sub-bullets here, each of which denotes a different way of getting to strategic nuclear exchange, right? You don't even have to start with a fight. There was a possibility of strategic nuclear exchange coming out of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But you can also get to strategic nuclear exchange through tactical weapons, through an escalate to de-escalate strategy, after a conventional attack on the homeland, after a conventional attack on nuclear systems. The existence of multiple paths, just to repeat myself, suggests that there's going to be some incomparability between various points on this path. Okay, let me just step back one thing. If you think of escalation as a successive release from restraints, then things that look like they're going around in circles may not be. For instance, if you have a war in space and then one side attacks ground facilities, that may be considered an escalation. By the same token, if you have war on the ground and somebody attacks space facilities, that may be considered escalation. Okay? Now hold it. Don't we get to the same place either way? How can one of them be larger than the other? And the answer is because it's not a difference in intensity. It's a difference in the loosening of restraints. Okay, and with that, I turn it over to my good colleague.
Okay, just unmute myself. So what my task then is going to be is to take this theoretical argument and try to flesh out a little bit with the existing empirical studies that looked at the cyber escalation. And there are two types of arguments that have been advanced to explain why we have not observed so far escalation from cyberspace to conventional and nuclear particularly. So one argument has to do and is based on the experimental work and focuses on the biases, the way how people perceive a cyber domain vis-a-vis conventional domain. I will be talking about it at the greater lengths in a couple of more slides. But the bottom line, when you present people with hypothetical treatments, right, randomized treatments, in one case, you expose your subjects to the information about a cyber attack, and then in another scenario you expose your participants to the information about conventional attack with the same level of intensity. What we see that this expectation that you climb from one rank to another, that you cross threshold, is not symmetric. Basically, whenever you're presented with a cyber option, with a cyber attack, people are reluctant, respondents are reluctant to escalate to conventional or retaliate. I mean, we'll talk about it later. And whenever you present the hypothetical scenario when there was the attack carried out using conventional means, then the probability of response, so tit-for-tat strategy, is higher. Okay, so what we're seeing, one of the reasons why this a metaphor of ladder framework may not be quite consistent with how the public perceives, this is based on the public opinion and the public surveys, is that there is no similar path from escalating if the attack is carried out using cyber vis-a-vis the conventional means. Another criticism that emerges about this escalation ladder framework is that when we practice gaming and then the cyber options are given, then there are certain asymmetries and risk aversion that has been observed consistently throughout multiple years when the decision makers had a choice between deploying conventional versus cyber capabilities. There was a systematic underuse of cyber with perceptions or misperceptions that is going to have much higher escalation potential. Okay, and then I mean, what I did, just if you start looking even deeper and trying to understand the nature of ambiguity and going back to this perceptions, what is war, what is the act of war, and whether cyber attacks constitute the act of war, even within the American public, not looking at cross-cultural differences, these are among the first kind of empirical data, first surveys of the representative sample of the US population that was collected. So basically, if you ask them if a cyber attack on military installations, okay, including the Pentagon, constitutes an act of war, we have then this 57% says it should be considered, but there is a still close to 1/3 of the population says, well, not really, or it depends, and I really don't have an answer. Okay, this is 2010. You might want to say, yes, in 2010 we're not that vulnerable, or we don't understand the potential costs. And then a similar question was repeated several years later in 2014, somewhat different scenario in case of like hacking, for example, and pointing specifically at North Korea, saying if this is a hack, do you feel it is an act of war? And then there is also this 1/3 of population now feeling it was an act of war, and then others not feeling an act of war. So basically, even understanding whether this certain type of behavior crossed the threshold, going back to Martin's point, do we have the same threshold? No, and even within the same culture. Now, and this brings us to the way how this hypothetical escalation ladder is presented in the literature on cyber escalation. So this like metaphorical thinking, or rather stylized is that you start with the force posturing and then rivalry. Then we could transition, which gradually transitions to the proxy warfare or potential cyber attacks. Then what we see, it escalates limited conventional conflict. Then another threshold is crossed. We go to a large-scale conflict, and then we reach the nuclear war, right? Nuclear exchange. So this is this thinking based on that escalation as a ladder metaphor. What I tried to do, or what we see in the way how games unfold, then this much harder to reconstruct this ladder based on the sequence of moves, and obviously with understanding that games are highly classified information. So what is available in public domain? Okay, so reconstructing whether this sequence of moves in the games was consistent with the expectations. It's a little bit problematic in the sense that what we've seen for the 5 years for which unclassified data are available is that first the conventional capability were deployed and pushed to the limit, and only then, with the only one exception for one game 2012, only then decision makers on the blue team, the US side, turned to cyber capabilities, and there was a certain degree of frustration why they couldn't achieve the effects that they wanted. And it was also in relation to different types of targets, both at the tactical as well as the strategical level, to the extent it's possible to say from like unclassified sources, but it was going for C2 capabilities, or it was going for the conventional military capabilities, or it was influencing people, like local populations. So what I am trying to kind of get from the empirical aspects of how cyber has been deployed in hypothetical scenarios, the sequence that we should observe, first cyber as less escalatory as conventional, is not particularly useful. So this metaphor. So then if it's not particularly useful, then what is additional? So what is the alternative, right? So this is the key takeaway from cyber games is the cyber was deployed only after conventional options were exhausted, only against military targets, but there was high reluctance to deploy it against C2, command and control, partially because of the concern with the potentially escalation, because it would have been like strategic, considered to be strategic use of cyber. And then there was bias against it due to high risk aversion of US policymakers. And it was true regardless of the institutional environment, okay, as was changed between 2011 2016 with the authorization of use offensive cyber or not. Now, so if we are not happy between the mismatch of, like, we'll just skip it up. What we also see talking about the differences in perceptions of the thresholds, right? Whether there are cross-cultural differences, whether the same, the two sides see the same, like have the same threshold. There is also the survey evidence or experimental research shows that there are large cross-country differences in willingness to use cyber as to use conventional in response to cyber. So to escalate from a cyber to conventional domain, meaning that the thresholds from one domain to another may not be consistent. So for example, based on the research conducted in US, Russia, and Israel, so this is a support toward using cyber in one situation. If the cyber crisis was triggered using a cyber option, then the support was much higher in Russia, for example, compared to the United States, and much lower in Israel. So the notion here is that there seems to be cross-country differences in understanding of the thresholds at which time or at which point you transition from cyber to conventional, from conventional to cyber. Okay. Now, what we're trying to do here with this grid, at least, is to try to capture this notion of climbing up and also climbing laterally, right? So we deliberately don't use or try not to use word horizontally, because horizontal escalation could have multiple, like different meaning like horizontally escalating in a larger like geographic space. But what we want to capture with this grid, we want to demonstrate that because the pathways, escalation pathways, are not necessarily unique and they're not necessarily linear, then you should think of the escalation process as both vertical movement in terms of the intensity of the conflict, as well as lateral movement in terms of the capabilities employed and the complexity of the conflict as well. So this is just like a stylized escalation pathways. So you're not necessarily going to be moving linearly from point A to point B, but it could go from point C. So it is just a schematic representation of what Martin briefed you a couple of slides earlier, trying to understand, is this escalation or not? Because dimensionality of conflict is much more complex than this vertical or movements like climbing the escalation ladder. Now, and then I give it to Martin. Back to Martin.
Okay, let me just kind of wrap up with the next 3 slides. So what are some of the implications of what we've been talking about? First implication is escalation dominance. Escalation dominance is a theory that's credited to Herman Kahn that basically says if you are dominant at every level of conflict above the one that you're at, the other side will be inhibited, strongly inhibited from carrying out conflict. In a world of the metaphor of Herman Kahn's book, that makes a great deal of sense. But as perceptions about the rungs change, as you go from rungs to lattices, it becomes much harder. Okay, the other side's perception of who has dominance at which level of escalation may not match yours. And if you have a lattice and you have to cover multiple escalation paths, your task is going to be a great deal harder. Okay, the opportunity for the other side to say, well, if I go up the middle, to use an Ohio State term, I'm not going to be successful. But if I go to one side and try this and try that, I may be able to secure an advantage that will force the other side to itself escalate in order to counter, or it may not be able to counter. Okay, go to the next slide. And that brings up to a question, and here I'm going to go from rather speculative on this. Okay, if we assume that there is an interest in reducing escalation risks, what are your options? Okay, there are 3 of them. One of them is to basically give the other side the benefit of the doubt, to err on the side of lower risk, even if it jeopardizes achieving certain war goals. Okay? It's nice to say in theory, it generally happens that two sides who are conflicting with each other don't go around giving the other side the benefit of the doubt, don't even have a particularly good theory of mind to explain why the other side is doing what it does. Okay, we tend to ascribe reasons of morality to the, which is to say immorality to the other side, and the fact that they have a logic is something we just tend to overlook. Okay, the second portion, which is a high-risk one, was the sort of the Schelling-esque pass the onus. If you can escalate to a place where the other side faces an unacceptable risk of starting a nuclear war, an unacceptable risk, by the way, may be well below that of 100%. If yours is the last move, then you can achieve a dominance of the situation and force the other side to back down, particularly if you have an advantage at the side that you're currently on. In other words, this is sort of a version of escalation dominance, sort of. It actually has different metaphors. Needless to say, that's a pretty high-risk strategy. The last one is the one suggested, however, by the whole lattice issue, and that is the possibility, and the next slide will illustrate that well. Okay, that in fact, if you go far enough out into the lattice, you may be able to limit escalation moves by both sides, because essentially there isn't a particularly useful place to go to. You're sort of off on a sidetrack, right? Now the question is, to what extent will one side basically saying, I'm not getting what I want on a sidetrack, I'm going to go back to the main track and work that one, to which one would say, if the sidetrack is different enough from the main track, you may be in a position where you're starting war all over again, an action for which there is should be a great deal of inhibition. Okay. The other question is, what would constitute a sidetrack? And here I'm just guessing. Cyber may constitute a sidetrack. Okay, being able to carry out the conflict, to show that you're still in the game, to show that your interests are opposed and that you may be able to get the other side to quit, but at the same time, being limited in the amount of damage you can do and not having an easy or obvious way to get back to more violent means of conflict. Another possibility is domain-limited conflicts, such as in sea or space. And a third possibility are proxy conflicts, in which neither side has committed itself to the point where it cannot roll itself back. And with that, there's a lot of material, I understand, and I'll we will open up to questions.